Hi, welcome to the Teaching and Making Comics panel at the San Diego Comic-Con. My name is James Sturm. I'm a cartoonist whose work includes this book, Off Season, and I'm also the co-founder and current director of a school for cartoonists in White River Junction, Vermont. I'm really pleased and happy to be facilitating this panel where I will be joined by the following cartoonists and educators: Ebony Flowers, whose most recent book is Hot Comb; Roman Muradov, whose book Vanishing Act, as you can see, looks incredible; the legendary Trina Robbins, whose most recent book is The Flapper Queens. She's written extensively about comics and a pioneer of the medium as well. And last but not least, we have Sophie Yanow, whose book, The Contradictions, is being released right around now through Drawn and Quarterly Books. So thank you, everybody, for joining me today. So I'd like to start this panel by maybe going around our boxes. And for those not familiar with your work, our virtual audience, please introduce yourself, maybe talk a little bit about your practice as a cartoonist and how it relates to you being maybe a teacher or an educator as well. Ebony, would you like to kick this off for us?
Yeah, so my name is Ebony and I'm the author of Hot Comb, and Hot Comb is a mix of short stories, fiction and nonfiction short stories that loosely revolve around Black women's hair and deal with broader themes of family, place, and belonging, wrapped into vestiges of racism, sexism, and classism. I've been a teacher for a long time. I didn't start out teaching comics. I started out as a high school biology and environmental science teacher. I've worked in a number of public school systems, and then I also taught middle school and high school math in Luanda, Angola, which is in sub-Saharan Africa, and I have a PhD in education. That in no way makes me an expert on teaching making comics, but I have taught making comics at Wisconsin and University of Toronto. And now I just mainly do it as workshops. I don't have a formal teaching position tied to a university. So if I am teaching comics, it's through making workshop or doing workshops.
Thank you. How about yourself, Roman?
Hi, I'm Roman Muradov. I'm an author, illustrator, artist, whatever. Originally from Russia. I've been here for about 10 years, and I'm a professor at the California College of Arts so far. I teach there a class called Pictures and Words, which is an elective that I do every now and then on top of my usual illustration class. It is not well, I'm very adamant that it's not a comics class, and it's just about intersection of writing and drawing, and I try to keep it pretty open-ended. My latest book is actually not the one that you showed, but sorry. This thing, it just came out, only in French so far. It's a kind of pseudo-biographical work about Marcel Duchamp's 3 months in Munich. And I have no idea if it will ever be published in English, but there we go.
Can you bring the pages closer, like one of the pages? Sorry.
Well, it's okay. I don't want to take up time.
Oh, okay.
Trina, can you tell us
Trina
a little bit about...
Robbins. Oops, I'm sorry, go on.
Oh, no.
What were you going to say, James?
The square is yours.
Oh, okay. I'm Trina Robbins. I'm a writer, and I call myself a historian because I specialize in the history of women cartoonists, early women cartoonists who, until I started writing about them, had never been written about. And my big epiphany in researching all of these books, all of these artists, is that if you're not written about, you're forgotten. So I make sure these women are not forgotten anymore. And The Flower Queens is coming out on August 18th, which is a birthday present for me because my birthday is August 17th. So that will be nice.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Sophie.
Yeah, I'm Sophie Yanow. The Contradictions is my forthcoming book. It's a coming of age story involving hitchhiking and shoplifting and learning about stuff in the world. And yeah, my teaching, I've taught at the Center for Cartoon Studies for a couple of years and assisted classes for a couple more years. Before that, I've also given workshops at, anarchist book fairs over the years and various other schools. So, yeah, that's me.
Actually, I just talked about my books, but I forgot to mention that I have taught for many, many years I've taught in grade schools and in middle schools and just writing comics, writing for adults in various writing workshops.
So for all of us, no one's kind of, well, maybe we all are born a cartoonist in some ways. We all love to draw as youngins. We're not too self-conscious about it. But at a certain point, we decided kind of to take ourselves more seriously as cartoonists. And we took steps, whether to educate ourselves, to kind of level up as cartoonists. And I guess I'd be curious to hear everybody what you kind of consider both your kind of formal education of learning how to make comics and what your casual education was in terms of making comics. And that could include mentors or influences. Ebony, why don't you start us out?
Yeah, so I'm maybe in the minority here, but I didn't start making comics until I was like maybe 31, 39 now. And my background again is in biology and anthropology, and so I had no intention of drawing or making comics. I was never known as the person who could draw in any of my classes or experiences in school. And so I came about this cartooning while I was getting my master's degree in education. My original plan was to go and work for the federal government, which I'm glad I didn't do. But I was looking for alternative ways of understanding and representing my research. And so I was looking at lots of different classes at Wisconsin, and I came across this artist in residence class. I think this was in 2012, and at the time, Linda Berry was teaching it, and I clearly had no idea who she was because I never read comics either. And so I liked the poster, and so I signed up for the class, and I got in, and it was an incredible class, and it taught me a lot about storytelling, and it heavily influenced how I rethought and looked at my data in while getting my master's degree, and then going on and getting my PhD. And really, it was her, and like she stayed on at Wisconsin and became full-time faculty. And so I took a couple more classes with her, and then she had a lab at the Wisconsin Institutes for Discovery, which is an interdisciplinary research base at the university. So she had her own lab called the Image Lab, and I was one of her project assistants, and I spent a few years working with her in that way. And one of the things that we did was teach drawing and making comics to scientists and social scientists and folks like me who were looking for different ways of presenting their research and their like knowledge base to a broader audience, but didn't necessarily have the artistic background that would give a person confidence to do it. And so, yeah, that's how I got into it. And Yeah, so I knew Linda at first as a teacher, before I knew her as like a cartoonist, and so she heavily influenced my way of thinking about teaching and pedagogy and creativity. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Sounds like Linda's approach too is incredibly inclusive, right? Like, doesn't matter what your background is, where you're from, she's going to meet you where you're at as a teacher.
Yeah, it's a pretty lively experience to be in her classroom, and I'll think more about it and kind of chime in, but I would, yeah, just start off with saying her approach is incredibly lively and a little rogue. And by that I mean that she follows the rules but doesn't necessarily follow them to the T, which makes the learning experience, I think, more viable for people who might not really think much of it, of making comics or cartooning. And I'd say I gravitated towards her approach because with teaching like biology and math, it's a pretty kind of like straight and narrow, like a kind of narrow way of thinking about how to teach those subjects. And I no longer teach those subjects, but if I went back and taught, it would be completely different, and it would be based on like her way, her style of teaching.
Thank you. Roman, do you want to talk a little bit about your kind of formal and casual education as a cartoonist? I noted in just looking at the PDF I was sent of your work, it looks like you're pulling in so many different influences into your work. And like Ebony, you weren't kind of like grew up living, eating, and breathing comics. Like you had a broad range of interests that kind of funneled into your work, that you brought to your work.
Yeah, can you guys hear a hose, by the way?
You sound good to me.
There's someone watering outside, and I'm wondering if that's interfering.
You don't hear it.
No hose. Yeah, so I actually also started pretty late. I never read comics because I grew up in Russia. We didn't have any of that. And I was a petroleum engineer because my dad told me to. And then after that, I kind of grew something of a spine and decided to come here and have a second stab at my life. And I never really enjoyed drawing or doodled or anything like that. So I only started in my mid-20s or so. I always wanted to be maybe a writer or a translator, but again, my dad told me those are feminine professions, which I'm happy to have now. But basically, yeah, I had most of my education in the library, just reading. Also, English is my second language, so it's kind of a dual purpose. And I never really wrote in Russian, but once I learned English, it became really natural, and I realized that I have not only my own syntax, but a certain style that is not just a mishmash of Nabokov, Proust, and whoever I was reading. And I think once I get proper arthritis, I will just become a writer. But so far I can draw, so I might as well. But yeah, I was always a terrible student in every institution that I attended. I took a lot of pride in graduating with all C's in my high school, to the extent that I think my Russian teacher wanted to give me a B, and I asked her to give me a C, just so it's like pure mediocrity, you know, unadulterated.
Yeah. keep your C cred.
That's right.
Were there when you set out to make a graphic novel or longer visual narratives, were there any major influences then, or do you feel like you were that you were either cartoonists you were looking at or instructors that you took something from, or do you feel like you were constructing that kind of, you know, by your own lights?
Well, you know, on a personal level, I think as for many people, the first book was exploration of personal trauma. Then it became slightly less about me. In terms of influences, kind of went all over the place. Like you said, yeah, I try to be as diverse in my consumption of art as I can be. And I very strongly believe that reading is much more important than creating art. And I also see my approach to drawing and reading as being pretty much the exact same thing. So, you know, a lot of my books have many silent pages where nothing is said, but the way I write them is I write them out like a novel. So like I don't storyboard at all. I just write a novel and then kind of translate that into pictures. Which probably doesn't make any sense. But in terms of approach, I think that is influenced by my predominant reading, which has been books without pictures in them. But visually, yeah, I mean, it goes all the way, like from manga to, you know, mid-century stuff. And yeah, I like really trashy art and very highbrow things and conceptual and folk art and everything. As long as it's weird, I'll find something in it.
Thank you. Trina, do you want to talk a little bit about your formal and casual education as a historian and as a cartoonist?
And as a writer, please.
And as a writer.
I'm a retired cartoonist. I haven't drawn comics since the early 90s. But I can tell you that excuse me, I think I was born drawing. That was first. I wasn't born writing because I had to learn how to write before I could be a writer. For that, I have to thank my mother, who when I was 4, taught me to read and write, and I immediately dove into both. My influences really are books and comics. As a kid, I read tons of comics. I was a definite comic reader, and my influences are the comics I read when I was a kid. I'm a dropout. I really a fail out. I mean, college flunked me out because I just lost interest and stopped going. Because in those days, if they had taught comics, I probably would have stayed. But in those days, it was all huge wall-sized abstracts where you threw the painted paper and stuff like that. And comics was very looked down on. I didn't even know I was a cartoonist. I mean, I just knew that I wanted to draw little real things on paper. Education, I mean, really, I'm totally self-taught. I mean, of course, I went through high school and a tiny bit of college. But really, when I look back at high school, the only thing I really learned was French. Everything else, everything I know is from reading about it, you know, and that's how you learn. So it's really hard. I mean, my influences are the early comics I read. And of course, I love writing. I also write comics and books. And
yeah, I have a question for you. You know, you were editing comics and comic books years ago, and you were working with other cartoonists shoulder to shoulder, perhaps. Did that group of cohorts, because really a lot of what a school provides is just a group of really intense, focused people who all want to learn and grow together, right, and collect them. Do you feel you had that when you were assembling It Ain't Me Babe or other or Twisted Sister, anything like that? That kind of.
I never worked on Twisted Sister.
Oh, I'm sorry. It Ain't Me Babe. Would you consider you had that, or did that? What did you learn from that experience as a writer, or if you were still cartooning for some of that time?
Oh yeah, I was drawing and also drawing for women's comics. Well, when I did It Ain't Me Babe, really, I was, you know, that title and the whole book was really inspired by the first feminist newspaper, also called It Ain't Me Babe. And I worked with the staff very closely. You know, they because it had their name. They had to like approve of things and make suggestions, but they weren't artists. I was really the only artist. I was kind of like the staff artist. Later with women's comics, suddenly there were lots of women, and a lot of us were in the Bay Area. So we got to see each other a lot. And that was great. I mean, that really, for me, women's comics for many years was a safe space where I could get together with these women. We could get together over coffee and hang out. And it was people who did what I was doing, women who did what I was doing. By that time, I had already formed what I wanted to do. So I don't think any of them was an influence, but there was just this companionship and this feeling of a safe space.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think sometimes influences can really shape your work, but then just also being inspired by other people can help you continue to make work as well.
My influences were basically a bunch of dead guys and some women. I mean, I didn't know when I was reading them as a kid whether they were male or female.
Great, thank you. Sophie Yanow, could you speak a little bit to your kind of formal and casual education as a cartoonist, mentors, influences, and such?
Yeah, so I definitely started drawing as a little kid and did it a lot, but comics didn't really come naturally to me, even though I was really kind of obsessed with them. Like actually drawing them and sticking to it was very hard. So I read a lot of stuff, and starting around 15, I used to go to comic conventions like the Alternative Press Expo in San Francisco. And I feel like although it was, not as a matriculated student, I feel like going to panels like this one was actually sort of the beginning of my more pseudo-formal comics education. And I was really kind of hungry to learn things, even though making stuff, actually following through with things was difficult. I went to a panel at Comic-Con actually with Gabrielle Bell, where she talked about some of her technique, and that was right after I graduated from college. So I studied like studio art in college, and did some independent studies making comics, but I really didn't actually make that much at that time. Just trying to understand where to start from and starting too big, making full color 11 by 17 watercolor pages and things like that. And just, crapping out after a few pages of a story. So I think going to those panels and then yeah, having sort of informal comics communities. I was a part of a group called the Dirty Drawers in the Bay Area first, and then later moved to Montreal and joined a studio there. And just being around like groups of cartoonists. Gabrielle Bell, again, I started doing a memoir thing that she had done, doing a daily comic for a month. And I think that was when I really found a method of working that clicked for me. And that a lot of my sort of the building blocks have come from after that. And then eventually I was a fellow at the Center for Cartoon Studies, and I got to sit in on the classes there. And I became a student the following year because, again, I felt like I couldn't reach the next step. I already had a book published, but I really wanted to do like a longer graphic novel. And so I enrolled because I just wanted to figure out how to do that, and I couldn't do it on my own. So yeah, I feel like I've had a kind of the gamut of experiences for informal and formal education.
Thank you. One of the things I'd like to talk about, and I know this will vary for all of us, but I know the culture of cartooning has just changed so much. Like when I first started teaching 90s, I mean, there'd be classes where all people would do would like debate, not my classes, like, the difference between like Spawn and Spider-Man. And that would, that would constitute a class. And now what we're looking at, and and I'm not sure whether maybe because we're all in a sense like communicating visually with emojis and text, like we're all embedding narrative into this visual architecture. The culture certainly has changed, and how that ongoing discussion is kind of affecting the work you do in the classroom, and maybe specifically a little bit about if the idea like of do you feel like there's been some kind of canon that has been presented to you as a cartoonist, and do you feel like that's changing at all, and how do we help make that change to allow for, you know, a broader look at our kind of our shared history as I should say visual story makers. Ebony, can you try to make sense out of that rambling question for me?
So you were asking about if I was taught a specific canon, like a body of literature that, or a work of comics that was supposed to be representative of what's out there, like
Yeah, well, I
seminal
guess.
pieces to.
What were your perceptions of what comics were before you started? You said you didn't think of yourself as a cartoonist. You didn't, start cartooning until you were into your 30s. What was your kind of perception kind of going into it? And then how did that change, I guess, after you started, engaging with a formal education around it?
Okay. So going into it, I didn't really think much about it. Like, I was actually shocked that Linda was like having us make comics, honestly. I knew that there would be drawing involved because that's what it said in the course description, but I wasn't shocked. I was like, oh, okay, we're gonna make comics. So I literally never thought about comics. I remember like my brother being really into X-Men as a kid, but again, like that was something that he did, and so he had a little box of like X-Men comics that he would go flip through. I was never interested in that. I feel like I'm one of the few people, like cartoonists, who actually like sports. So I was like doing that. And so when I started working with Linda, she doesn't really teach like a canon, like saying like these are the books that you need to know in order to make comics. If anything, the comics are there. So, she has a ton of comics, and she had them in the classroom, and they're there for people to kind of like peruse. But there was nothing like required that we had to read. And when I teach longer classes where I like folks to read comics as well, I do the same thing where I bring as many comics that I have to the classroom, and then just kind of pray that they bring them back to me. And so there wasn't really a specific canon, and there wasn't really a specific way of saying like this is a comic and this isn't a comic. She never really did that either. I think the approach what I got from her, one of the things I took away from her and how I teach is that drawing is a way of thinking, and drawing is a place for an experience rather than making something that's a good or bad. And so when I teach making comics, that's what I try to emphasize, is that you're here to have an experience, and you're here to figure out this way of telling stories visually, and to try to get people to kind of release themselves from this idea of making a good or bad drawing. Because I think even with more seasoned artists, when they get stuck on this idea that the picture has to be perfect, the story ends up not being so great. And they tend to focus too much on like page layouts and like cool little, I don't know, cool little panels that don't really bring anything to the story. And so I try to emphasize like having a relationship to drawing that enhances the storytelling. That
Thank
makes
you.
sense.
It does. I'm going to jump to Trina with that question about the kind of changing culture of cartooning and the work that we put forward, whether it's considered a canon or like yourself, Ebony, it's just like, here are the things that I have gravitated towards and I'm going to expose my students to them. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, of course, I would say starting from the early 60s through really the turn of this century, the canon was that if you wanted to draw comics, you had to draw in a certain style, you know, because it was all dominated by Marvel and DC and superhero comics, which immediately left out most women, because women, this isn't a style, and we are different, you know. A lot of people go, they're horrified when I say men and women are different, you know. We are different. Women tend not to be interested in drawing or reading comics about guys with big chins and too many muscles beating each other up. That's it. But little boys love it, you know. Who am I to figure out how little boys' brains work? But, you know, it's not what women and girls like. And through that huge period, I'm talking about 40 years, if you were a woman, you were sunk, you know. If, you know, there were a few women, really 2 women that I can think of who used to draw, who were able to draw like that. They didn't even necessarily like it, but it was a living. So they did it. And it's only really in this century that art has opened up, that comics have opened up. I mean, I look at the interior pages that you showed on the screen of the comics that these people are doing, and they're fantastic. And they're done in styles that never would have been accepted, you know, in the last century. So, you know, we're breaking away from that canon. Thank God we're breaking away from that canon.
Yeah. Roman, do you have any thoughts you want to share on this subject?
Yeah, I'm not fond of the comics canon, to put it mildly. I remember reading that Scott McCloud book and thinking, what are you talking about? This is like anti-art. You know, like, who cares if the guy has the same haircut from one panel to another? So yeah, I came into it being like really skeptical and became more skeptical as I went along. I think there's still, there is probably value in someone like me teaching, because it's not really ingrained in my culture at all, and I have that kind of cynical European outlook, perhaps. But also, I really also agree with what Ebony said, that it's not about quality, and it really shouldn't be. And one thing that I constantly try to beat into my students is that when they look at that drawing or a page or whatever, or a sentence, they shouldn't think how this can be better, but how this can be different. Like in my own practice, I end up doing usually like 5 or 6 versions of pretty much every single panel or page. You know? And it's not because I'm a perfectionist. It's just because I want to see what else can be done. But it's the same way that I write. Like usually it's kind of a voice that I transcribe, but then I move words around just endlessly. And I think my point is that style is substance, and that is something that I don't really hear being said a lot these days. People tend to focus on the story, in my opinion, a little too much. And I feel that the whole idea of style as something that's like attractive or seductive is not very pleasing to me. But the idea of style as a narrative device, as something that does carry what you're trying to do, is really important. And I think somewhat underexposed. So like the ideas of how many different ways you can draw the same chair and what would it say? What would the feeling and the concept behind it be? I think that's something I really try to explore with my students, and not so much look at like, well, this is how Chris Ware draws a chair, and it certainly looks like a chair, and this is how you should do it. But be like, well, another thing I always do is try to prohibit them from looking at references like, at all. Of course, they never obey, but they can try. And I'm like, well, just draw it from your head. And I'm trying to get into each student's individual weirdness and their own perception, and try to channel that in and see what narrative and conceptual potential is in it, rather than try to bring it up to some kind of standard of excellence, which of course doesn't exist.
Yeah, while you were describing the chair, I was thinking of Saul Steinberg. One of his collections, he has this like 6-7 pages of just chairs.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, he was a huge influence on my thinking for sure. And I don't think there's ever been a class when I didn't bring him up. He was also someone who struggled with English language and found drawing as a way of communicating.
Right, and oftentimes cartoonists are outsiders, right? Whether they're immigrants or just outside the mainstream culture, and that that position is a strength in terms of being able to look at something from the outside. Sophie, you want to talk about the changing culture of cartooning? I know we've sat in on meetings where we've discussed what books should we be exposing our students to, and those are always such fraught discussions. And wonder if you have any thoughts on any of that.
Yeah, I think this is something I've thought about a lot, like working on this book in particular, because I'm the style that I ended up working in is this sort of clear line style, which comes out of the Franco-Belgian, more traditional canon, and in particular Hergé, who, his comics had almost no women. He's, a lot of his comics are incredibly racist. He had this arc growth story that we can talk about where he maybe got a little bit better, but my book is like visually referencing that, and in some ways I wanted to do an adventure story that it's set in Western Europe, and the two protagonists are these queer, or at least the protagonist is a queer woman, and it's striving to be hopefully it's not racist, but I'm a white woman, so but yeah, I do think there is I don't have a good answer about like what should people be exposed to. I do think I am not interested in showing, like crumb work, which is, some would say, just amazing cartooning. And yeah, it's I don't have a good answer, but it's definitely on my mind quite a bit. But yeah, I do think exposing, there are so many artists out there, and comics is supposed to be this medium that's really accessible, just the way that it's created. It's not something where you need, millions of dollars and a whole camera crew, right? Like film. And yet, I think the canon is still predominantly white men. And like the alternative comics that I was exposed to, your Dan Clowes' and your Chris Ware's, I think the focus there is much more on creating this perfect image, working towards perfection. And I have really enjoyed comics from those folks, but I do wonder about how we can
right.
how we can change that, because comics it should be this more accessible medium, but I don't think the canon reflects that.
Yeah, I think.
Can I jump in real quick?
Please do.
So I have, I wouldn't say taught Robert Crumb, but I've had it like a part of the, like, my display of things to read. and in addition to other people, cartoonists that I particularly wouldn't care too much for. I don't know if I can. Anyway, so there's a whole list of like cartoonists that I'm just like, eh. And when I was teaching in Toronto, so I've been in a situation where like I've always thought of comics as like a white person thing. Like, I want to be offensive, but it was like, oh, that's some white people. And so in my experience with teaching comics is that most of the people I teach to are white, and there are a few folks who are queer, but most of them are, you know, heteronormative, like white dudes, some women too. And when I taught at Toronto, it was the first time where my class was very mixed, and there were like 2 white people and the rest were like, you know, immigrants and from all over the place, like Black and brown people. And it was the first time I felt like I had to teach, and I'm totally not an expert on this, but I felt like I had to acknowledge the history of comics and the problematic history of comics, and not pretend like it's this kind of like accessible thing that anyone can gravitate towards, and that you know, some very successful cartoonists today don't draw people that like, you know, drive me up the wall because, you know, they're so phenomenally offensive, or the subject matter or whatever. But I still teach that because not as like a learning, like a lesson about racism, but just to expose folks to all these different ways that comics have been presented and are still being drawn, and just to expose folks to it, and not with this kind of the underlying thing of like, you can't draw like this or you can't present work in this way, but just say like, this is how it's been presented, and if you have a problem with it, then how can you address that in your storytelling if you want to, kind of thing. But I do feel like folks like Robert Crumb and some other people, because they're still kind of like highly regarded, I feel like just show them. I try not to censor as much as possible. But yeah, there's some cartoons that drive me up the wall. But anyway,
I think also
that's for another conversation that's not recorded.
Yeah. Thank you, though. Also, I know, like, at the Center for Cartoon Studies, one of the first things we do in a survey class in the last few years is we go to the Hood Museum, and they have this incredible collection of Hood ledger drawings by the Plains tribes. And they're basically graphic novels from the 1800s that were torn out of ledger books. But the most talk about materials that were on hand, you know, just colored pencils and old ledger books. And I don't know why we don't think of those as America's first graphic novels. And probably because the industry of comics, the Marvels and the DCs and the probably New Yorker gag comics, the strips and the syndicates, those are basically, they've written the history for so long. And I think they're, you know, it's important as an educator to kind of recognize that that's a very limited lens to look at it through. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for taking the time. I know there's so much going on in the world right now. So just to carve out a little time just to talk about cartooning and teaching and how it kind of overlaps with some of these larger issues in our culture.